Esin was walking past her father's study when she heard voices inside. She slowed down, curious, and then stopped completely when she heard her name. "She will get nothing," her father said to his lawyer, his tone cold. "Not a single kobo. I don't care what she thinks she deserves." Her heart pounded so hard she thought it would give her away. She pressed her back against the wall, listening as the lawyer asked if he was sure. "Completely sure," her father replied. "When I'm gone, she leaves with nothing." Esin's throat tightened, but she didn't move. She turned and walked quietly to her room, fighting the sting of tears. That night, she lay awake remembering something her late mother had given her, a sealed envelope hidden in a drawer. Inside was a property deed, signed and registered in Esin's name. She had kept it safe for years, never knowing when she might need it. Now she knew. At the will reading in Abuja, the family sat around the lawyer's table. The will was read exactly as she had overheard, everything to her stepbrothers, nothing for her. When it ended, Esin calmly reached into her bag and handed the lawyer an envelope. He opened it, scanning the papers, and then looked up. "This property belongs solely to Miss Esin. It is not part of the estate." The room went silent. Her father's face turned pale. Esin met his eyes and said quietly, "You said I'd get nothing. Mama made sure you were wrong." Then she stood and walked out, leaving them in stunned silence. Lindai was on her way to drop some lecture notes in her father's study when she heard his voice through the half-open door. She paused, thinking he was on the phone. Then she heard her name. "She's too stubborn to deserve a cent," he said, his voice cold. Lindai's chest tightened. She stepped closer, barely breathing. "Her name is already out of the will," he continued. "That inheritance. I've hidden it where she'll never find it." For a moment, she thought she might burst into the room, but something in her told her to stay quiet. Her fingers trembled as she pulled out her phone, pressed record, and captured every single word. His tone was so casual, like he wasn't talking about destroying his own daughter's future. When he finally hung up, Lindai slipped away, her heart heavy but her mind racing. She didn't know exactly how she'd use it yet, but she knew one thing: she wasn't going to walk away quietly. A week later, the family gathered in a sleek law office in Johannesburg. Everyone was dressed in black, speaking in low voices, pretending to be united in grief. Lindai sat at the far end of the table, her father across from her, relaxed and confident. The lawyer began reading the will. Just as she'd overheard, her name wasn't there. Everything was left to her stepbrothers. She could see them exchanging smug glances, already planning how they'd spend it. When the lawyer closed the folder, Lindai stood up slowly. "Before we finish," she said, her voice steady, "there's something I'd like everyone to hear." She pulled out her phone, pressed play, and set it on the table. Her father's voice filled the room, clear and undeniable, calling her too stubborn, saying he had cut her out, boasting about hiding her rightful inheritance. Gasps rippled across the room. Her stepbrothers shifted uncomfortably. Her father's face drained of color. The lawyer leaned forward, his tone suddenly serious. "Miss Lindai, this recording is enough to challenge the will in court. If what's said here is true, the law will favor you." Lindai looked straight at her father, her eyes steady. "You thought I'd walk away quietly," she said. "But I'm not leaving without what belongs to me." She picked up her bag, turned, and walked out of the room. Behind her, she could hear whispers, chairs scraping, and her father calling her name, but she didn't stop. For the first time in years, she felt in control. Amara was walking down the hallway when she heard her father's voice coming from the sitting room. She slowed down, then froze when she heard her name. "She's not even my real daughter," he said, his tone cold and sharp. Her heart thudded in her chest. She moved closer, careful not to make a sound. "When I'm gone, she'll get nothing. I only raised her because her mother begged me." The words hit her like a blow. She had already lost her mother years ago. Now she felt like she had lost her father too, even though he was still alive. Her eyes stung, but she refused to let the tears fall. She quietly turned and went to her room, closing the door softly. That night she lay awake, her mind racing with one question: if he's not my father, then who is? A week later, The family gathered in a lawyer's office in Nairobi for the will reading. The air felt tense, with polite smiles hiding greed and rivalry. Amara sat at the far end of the table, her father refusing to look her way. The lawyer began reading the will. Just as she'd overheard, she was left with nothing. Her half-siblings shifted in their seats, trying not to grin. Then the lawyer paused. "Before we close," he said, pulling out another file, "there is a second will to be read, this one from the late Mr. Daniel N. George." A ripple of confusion moved through the room. Amara's head lifted. "Daniel, her father's best friend," the lawyer continued. "Mr. N. George declares that Amara is his biological daughter. He leaves her his 2 homes, farmland in Kiambu, and 60% of his company shares." Gasps filled the room. Amara's father's face drained of color, his jaw tightening. The truth poured out right there. Her mother and Daniel had been together before she married the man she had called her father all her life. Daniel had always known she was his child but kept silent, protecting her from the truth until he was gone. Amara's hands trembled, not from fear but from the weight of what she'd just learned. In 1 week, she had lost a father and gained another. One had abandoned her in the cold. The other had left her everything he could. She stood slowly, picked up her bag and walked toward the door. She didn't look back. That day, she became an orphan twice. But for the first time in her life, she knew exactly where she came from. Bull was heading to the kitchen late at night when she heard voices coming from her father's office. She slowed down, staying hidden in the hallway. "She's too soft, too emotional," her father said coldly. "I'm cutting her off completely. The farm will go to her brothers. She can survive on whatever she finds." Her throat tightened and tears filled her eyes, but she didn't move. This was the same man who used to hold her hand while they planted seeds, calling her "my little farmer." Now he spoke of her like she was nothing. She quietly turned away, wiping her face. If he thought she would just cry and accept it, he was wrong. 2 years earlier, her late mother had taken her to the land registry. Without telling her father, her mother had added Bull's name as co-owner of the family's most valuable farm. The documents were official, signed, stamped, and locked away safely. At the time, Bull hadn't understood why. Now she did. The day of the will reading arrived. The family gathered in the lawyer's office, dressed in black, pretending to mourn. Bull sat silently, her father avoiding her eyes. The lawyer read the will. Just as she had overheard, everything was left to her brothers. She heard one of them chuckle quietly. When the reading ended, Bull stood up. "There's something you should all see." She pulled a large brown envelope from her bag and handed it to the lawyer. He opened it, scanning the pages, then looked up with raised eyebrows. "This," he said slowly, "is the legal title for Maconia Farm. It shows Miss Bull as co-owner, registered 2 years ago." The room went silent. Her brother's smirks disappeared. Her father's face turned red, his jaw tight. But there was nothing he could say, the law was clear. Bull looked him straight in the eye. "You laughed at my tears," she said quietly. "But Mama made sure I'd never have to cry for what's already mine." She picked up her bag and walked out, leaving them in a silence heavier than any words she could have spoken. Chica was passing by the veranda one evening when she heard her father's voice. She stopped, hidden behind the wall, and listened. He was speaking to someone on the phone. "I've already made the changes," he said. "Chica gets nothing. Everything will go to her stepbrothers. It's better this way. She doesn't have the head for business." Her hands clenched at her sides. This was the man who used to tell her she was the smartest in the family, the man who once taught her how to read financial reports. She stood there in shock as he continued, explaining how the new will would leave her with absolutely nothing. She slipped away quietly, her mind reeling, but she knew something her father had forgotten. Years ago, when she was just finishing university, her father had written her a personal letter. In it, he had praised her for saving one of his deals from collapse and promised her the controlling shares of his company one day. He had signed it himself, and it was dated, sealed, and witnessed by his oldest friend. She had kept it all these years, thinking of it as just a sentimental keepsake. Now she realized it was her weapon. The day of the will reading came. The family gathered in a high-rise office in Lagos, the skyline stretching behind them. Chika's stepbrothers sat tall, their suits crisp, their smiles smug. Her father looked relaxed, certain of his victory. The lawyer began to read the will. Just as she'd overheard, she was left with nothing. Everything was split between her stepbrothers. When the reading ended, her brothers leaned back in their chairs, looking satisfied. Chika didn't move for a moment. Then she reached into her bag and pulled out a slim, worn envelope. "Before we end," she said, handing it to the lawyer, "I believe this changes things." The lawyer opened it, read the contents, and looked up sharply. "This letter, dated and signed by Mr. Adeyemi, clearly states that Miss Chika is to receive controlling shares of Adeyemi Holdings. It is witnessed and legally binding." The room went still. Her stepbrothers' faces darkened. Her father's jaw tightened, his eyes flashing with something between shock and anger. But it was too late. The letter was proof, and the law was on her side. Chika stood, her voice calm but firm. "You plotted to take everything from me," she said to her father. "But you gave me the key yourself." She picked up her bag and walked out, leaving the room in silence, knowing the war was already won. Ruto was walking past her father's study when she heard him talking to her uncle. She paused at the door, hidden in the shadows. "When I'm gone," her father said, "she'll leave with nothing but the clothes on her back." Her breath caught in her throat. "The land, the money, all of it will go to the boys. She's had enough from me already." The words cut deep. This was the man who once told her she was his greatest blessing. Now he spoke about her like she was a stranger. She didn't say a word, just walked back to her room, each step heavier than the last. But there was one thing he didn't know. A few years ago, her father had signed a land deal in her name. It wasn't a gift, he had done it for tax purposes, thinking she wouldn't notice. But Ruto had kept the official documents, signed and registered, locked away safely. She hadn't planned to use them, until now. The day of the will reading came in Harare. The family sat in the lawyer's office, dressed in black but wearing fake smiles. Her father's will was read just as she expected, everything to her brothers, nothing for her. She could feel their eyes on her, waiting to see her break. When the lawyer closed the file, Ruto reached into her bag. "Before we finish," she said, pulling out a thick brown envelope, "please read this." The lawyer took it, unfolded the papers, and began to read aloud. "This is a legal document signed by the late Mr. Dubé, transferring full ownership of Plot 17 to Miss Ruto Dubé." He looked up, eyebrows raised. "This property is in her sole name. It is not part of the estate and cannot be touched by any other beneficiary." The room went dead silent. Her brother's smirks faded. Her uncle shifted uncomfortably in his seat. Her father's widow stared at her, speechless. Ruto stood, her voice steady. "You said I'd leave with nothing but clothes," she said softly. "Turns out, I'm leaving with land you can't take from me." She walked out without another word, the weight of the silence behind her heavier than any insult they could have thrown. This time she wasn't walking away empty-handed, she was walking away free. Zanil had always believed her father loved her, even if he wasn't the most affectionate man. But one evening, while visiting his house in Cape Town, she passed by his office and heard voices. She stopped when she recognized his tone, cold, calculating. "She's too soft," he was telling someone. "I'll replace her with Sifo in the will. She won't fight back." There was a short pause, then he added, "Besides, she won't even know I've been using her trust fund. By the time she finds out, it'll be gone." Her heart dropped. She wanted to burst into the room, but something inside her told her to keep quiet. She stepped back, pulled out her phone and hit record. Every single word was captured in a crisp, damning voice note. And that wasn't all. Zanil had been suspicious for a while and had already requested copies of her bank statements. What she found confirmed it. Large transfers from her trust fund to accounts she didn't recognize, accounts in her father's name. The day of the will reading came. The family was gathered, most of them dressed in mourning black but clearly more interested in who would get what. Her half-brother Sifo sat with an arrogant grin, convinced the day was his victory. The lawyer read the will, and just as her father had planned, Zanil's name was missing from the main inheritance. A few cousins gave her pitying looks. Saifo's smirk widened. Everyone expected her to cry, to quietly accept it. But Zanil didn't flinch. When the lawyer closed the file, she cleared her throat. "Before we end, I have something to share." She placed her phone on the table and pressed play. Her father's voice filled the room. "I'll replace her with Saifo. She won't even know I've been using her trust fund." The room froze. Gasps echoed. The lawyer's eyes widened, and some relatives covered their mouths. Zanil then pulled out the bank statements and slid them across the table. "These show every transfer he made from my trust fund to his own accounts. I've already filed a case with my lawyer." "This will," she said, tapping the paper in front of the stunned lawyer, "will not stand." Saifo's grin vanished. A few family members avoided her gaze, embarrassed. The lawyer sighed, already knowing this was about to become a legal storm. Zanil stood, her voice steady. "You thought I'd cry. You thought I'd let it go. But today, you're the ones leaving in tears." She walked out, her heels clicking against the floor, leaving behind a silence so heavy it felt like the walls were holding their breath. Adana had grown up knowing her father's love was selective. He could be warm in public but cold at home, especially after he remarried. One evening in Lagos, she passed by his study and froze when she heard her own name. The door was slightly open, and inside, her father sat with his new wife. "I'll erase her from the family," he said, his voice low but full of finality. "Once the will is done, she'll get nothing. She'll be gone for good." His wife's laugh was sharp. "Good. She's been a thorn in our side long enough." Adana's chest tightened, but she didn't move. She listened until their voices faded, then quietly walked away. She didn't cry. She didn't confront them. She just made a silent promise to herself. Whatever was coming, she would face it head-on. The day of the will reading arrived. The room was packed with family, half-siblings, and a few curious relatives who came more for gossip than grief. Adana walked in calmly, her head held high, and took a seat without looking at her stepmother. Her father sat across from her, confident, as if today would be his final victory over her. The lawyer began reading. Everyone leaned in, expecting to hear that Adana's name had been wiped clean from the inheritance list. But halfway through, the lawyer's voice caught slightly. "According to the terms of the trust and the original business registration, all assets, including the family fortune, are registered under Adana's name. Legally, these cannot be transferred or removed without her consent." The room went dead silent. Adana's father blinked rapidly, his face draining of color. "That's impossible," he muttered. The lawyer adjusted his glasses. "It's not impossible. It's legal fact. Your late father, Adana's grandfather, made her the primary beneficiary of the entire estate years ago. The clause is airtight." Gasps filled the room. Adana slowly turned her gaze to her father, holding it until he looked away. Then she glanced at her stepmother, whose confident smile had vanished completely. "I guess," Adana said softly but firmly, "you can't erase someone who owns everything." With that, she stood, gathered her bag and walked out. Every pair of eyes followed her, the whispers starting the moment the door closed behind her. The will reading hadn't just ended, it had flipped the family's entire power structure in a single sentence. Mukami had always been the quiet one in the family, the one who worked hard behind the scenes, never asking for credit. But one late night in Kigali, as she passed by her father's study, she heard words that cut straight through her. "She doesn't deserve anything," her father said to her uncle. "The business survived because of me, not her. I'm making sure she gets the smallest share possible." Mukami froze in the hallway. She wanted to burst in and shout the truth, but she didn't. Instead, she quietly pulled out her phone and hit record, capturing the rest of the conversation. And later, she went a step further. She found the security camera footage from 3 years ago, the day she'd convinced the bank not to foreclose on their company, the day she'd signed the deal that kept hundreds of workers employed. It was proof she had saved everything. The day of the will reading came. The family filled the lawyer's office, some smirking, others pretending to be neutral. Her father sat in the center, confident and almost smug. As the lawyer read out the distribution, Mukami's share came last, and just as her father had planned, it was shockingly small. Mukami didn't flinch. When the lawyer finished, she calmly stood up. "Before this is signed, I have something to show." She walked to the TV screen in the corner and connected her phone. First came the recorded video of her father's voice saying she didn't deserve anything. Gasps filled the room. Then, the security footage appeared. Mukami in the boardroom, negotiating with the bank officials, signing papers that saved the business. The room went silent. Her father's face drained of color. "That's irrelevant," he stammered. The lawyer shook his head. "No, this changes everything. If the company was saved because of Mukami's actions, she is entitled to a far greater share. The will must be amended before it's finalized." Mukami looked around the room, meeting every pair of shocked eyes. "I never wanted to fight my family," she said softly, "but I will fight for the truth." When she sat down, there was no more smirking, only silence and a deep, unspoken respect. That was the day her family stopped seeing her as the quiet one, and finally saw her true strength. Thandao had always believed her father would protect her, but one evening she passed by his study and heard the words that broke her heart. "She will get nothing," he told a relative. "Not even the house." She stood frozen, her chest tight, but instead of crying, she went digging. In an old box of family papers, she found something no one else seemed to know existed, a yellowed signed page from her late grandfather's will. In it, he had written that the family estate, including the house, would pass directly to her when her father died. No one else could claim it. The day of the will reading came. Her father sat with a smug smile, surrounded by relatives already imagining how they would split the property. The lawyer began to read, and as expected, Thandao's name wasn't mentioned at all. When he finished, she calmly stood up, reached into her bag, and pulled out the old document. "Before you finalize this," she said, her voice steady, "there's one more will you need to see." The lawyer's eyebrows shot up as he read it. The room went silent. Then he looked at her father. "According to this, the entire estate legally belongs to Thandao. No one else has a claim." Gasps filled the room. Her father's face turned pale. Thandao simply sat back down, the papers still in her hand. She hadn't just saved her home, she had taken control of everything they tried to take from her.